Napoleon III, the last monarch of France, is certainly an interesting and ambiguous personality. On the one hand, a populist dictator, and on the other hand, under his rule Paris acquired its modern look, became arguably beautiful, but definitely more comfortable and safer. And the country came out of the period of incessant unrest and revolutions. On the one hand, an opportunist who got involved in all the wars of the time. On the other hand, under his rule, relations with Great Britain and Russia improved, which in the future led to the formation of the Entente. Nevertheless, his end was fairly unambiguous. Embarrassing defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, capture, overthrow and unremarkable deaths in England. But what if events had gone a little differently? My name is Jacob and I welcome you to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And today I will tell you a story about the 19th century France in general, and Napoleon III in particular, using good old Victoria II with the grand combination mod. Will the events in the story be more pleasant for the emperor? Definitely. Will events in the story be more pleasant for France? Not definitely. Either way, you will figure out it for yourself by the end. Napoleon III and the natural borders of France in Victoria II. Our story, and indeed the history of modern France, begins with the First French Revolution. But what is interesting for us is its failure. Although the old feudal order was destroyed and the monarchy overthrown, the new democratic order was never completed, and the republic remained a rather fragile formation. Because of this, first the not quite democratic Directory came to power, restricting the previously existing universal suffrage, and then not at all democratic Napoleon I, first as consul and then as emperor, who conquered half of Europe. At this time, specifically in April 1808, our main character was born, Napoleon's nephew, Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, at the time Prince of Holland. However, Napoleon's rule also ended in failure, this time military one. After 2 defeats and 2 abdications, there were 2 restorations of the Bourbon monarchy that ruled until the revolution. And by 1815, Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed king, was entrenched on the throne. However, there was no complete return to the old order. This would likely have led to a new revolution, which was understood by both the new and decisive king and the countries of the anti-Napoleonic coalition. And the changes that Napoleon brought about were in fact quite beneficial. The Napoleonic administrative division, tax and judicial codes were preserved in the country. The new constitutional charter was working somehow. There was a conditional freedom of speech, which, however, could be legally limited. There was a double-chamber parliament, similar to the British, although the voters were only men aged at least 30 years, with an average life expectancy of about 40. And paying at least 300 francs of direct taxes, a total of about 90,000 people, the richest people in France. Oh, and Parliament had no legislative initiative, and could only discuss what the king brought them. But 90,000 people influencing decision-making is 89,899 more than it was before the revolution. However, the changes were clearly not enough. And the Bourbons, as say a brand, were terrible. The mood in France was such that people were looking forward to the death of an elderly childless king, and then maybe the monarchy would end on its own. But as luck would have it, it did not end. After Louis' death in 1824, his brother Charles X ascended the throne. A conservative, reactionary and, most importantly, a determined man, who began curtailing the already not very extensive freedoms. The most unpopular were the law to compensate the nobles, whose estates had been confiscated during the revolution, because it was clear from whom the money would be taken to pay these compensations, and the law to strengthen censorship, which the Chamber of Deputies never approved. By this example, it is clear that even the parliament, with its focus on the elites, was clearly not in favor of Charles. This is no good. So he tried to dissolve the parliament and to change the property census to a land census. That is, to leave only the nobility and the big bourgeoisie as voters. This decision of Charles was the trigger for the July Revolution of 1830. Parisians went to the barricades as in the good old days. The result of this revolution was on the one hand unexpected, but on the other hand it was hard to imagine any other option. First, under the influence of the rest of the government loyal to Charles, the latter abdicated, forcing his son to do the same, and his 10-year-old grandson, the son of his late favorite son, under the regency of his cousin, the Duke of Orleans Louis Philippe, was appointed as his successor. Parliament, however, refused to recognize him as king. The throne was empty. Then the logical solution would be to declare a new republic, right? Wrong. And the reason was not the political will of the establishment, at least not in the first place, but the foreign policy environment. After the past Napoleonic Wars, the big European countries had agreed on the immutability of the then borders, and importantly for the French, the joint suppression of revolutions in Europe. This concept has gone down in history as the European concert, and it essentially cemented the then status quo. And although by 1830 this concert was no longer playing as well as it once had, the participants would have had the strength and the will to suppress its root cause – the revolution in France. So the country needed a king, preferably of liberal views. And it was found. The king was chosen Louis Philippe, the same Charles' alleged regent, who began to create an image of such a roi citoyen, king citizen, king bourgeois. A so-called liberal monarchy was established in France. So, what changes took place under this liberal monarchy? Of course, there were no radical changes in the new constitutional charter, but something was changed. The flag of France again became the Republican tricolor. Freedom of speech became full and unconditional, which led to the appearance of, for example, such caricatures of the king. For this one, the author was imprisoned, because the king cannot be offended. Such a freedom. The parliament received legislative initiative, the tax census was lowered to 200 francs, and the age threshold was lowered by 5 years, which led to an increase in the number of voters to 250,000 people. But it was still the power of the bourgeoisie, now not even restricted by the nobility, who finally faded in the background. The other 30 million people, from workers and peasants to university professors and other intellectuals, were obviously dissatisfied with the situation, and each class was dissatisfied in its own way. The workers were dissatisfied with the Industrial Revolution that had finally reached France, which, because of the increase in labor productivity, was leading to medium-term job losses and a widening income gap, while the intellectuals were dissatisfied with the lack of suffrage. The reason for the peasants' discontent I will discuss later. Also, the new king received from his predecessor as a gift the ongoing war in Algeria, a victory in which the latter wanted to use to boost his popularity, but he didn't have time. Moreover, this war was not very successful. At first, French troops achieved significant victories, actually defeated the then ruler of Algeria and entered the city of Algiers. But not having time to take advantage of the situation, when the local allies were in turmoil, they missed the moment when it was possible to occupy the most important cities of the region without much trouble. And after the sacking of Algiers, the opinion of the local population about the French deteriorated considerably. So there was no quick conquest. In addition, at the same time there was a July Revolution, and power in the government was given to the liberals, who did not really want to conduct colonial wars, and in fact were going to stop this war. But by this time, the news of the initial victories in Algeria reached Paris and tilted public opinion in the metropole in favor of continuing the war. Therefore, the new government was afraid to stop the war, but at the same time withdrew 2/3 of the available troops there. The result was an unceasing war for 6 years, during which the French controlled only the coastal towns. By 1836, a more aggressive government had established itself, and they simply sent more troops, preparing a new expedition. Upon learning of the approaching army, Abdelkader, the head of the Algerian resistance, offered peace with the status quo. The French refused, and the Algerians, afraid to fight with an even-numbered army, and being themselves not a regular formation, began to desert. and from 50,000 by July they remained only 11. They were defeated at the Battle of Touggourt, and by 1837 Algeria was fully occupied. There was still the Beylik of Constantine, which adhered to neutrality, but it was captured in 1838. However, the victory in Algeria did not add to the popularity of the gradually losing regime. The king was turning into a peer. Louis-Philippe and the government even tried to suck up to people nostalgic for Napoleon. In 1837 completed the Arc de Triomphe, glorifying the victories of the latter, and then returned his ashes from Saint Helena, solemnly taking him under the same arc. By the way, what was Napoleon, I mean Charles-Louis Napoleon, doing at this time? After the fall of his uncle's regime, he and his mother and older brother wandered around Europe, and after a while they settled in the estate of Arenberg, Switzerland. There he enlisted, received a military education and even became captain of artillery. In 1830-31 he and his brother did some traveling in Italy and became members of the Carbonari, a secret revolutionary society fighting Austrian domination in northern Italy. But soon the Austrian and papal governments launched an offensive against the Carbonari, and the brothers, wanted by the police, were forced to flee. During their escape, the older brother contracted measles and died. A year later, Napoleon's son died of tuberculosis, and the role of head of the House of Bonaparte passed to Charles-Louis, which he, being a power-seeking man, was not averse to taking advantage of. In 1836 he made a frivolous attempt to seize power, based on the mere assumption that the heir to Napoleon, dressed as Napoleon and appeared in the barracks of Strasbourg, would be received with open arms by the soldiers. I think the failure of this endeavor will surprise no one. If the soldiers of one regiment he managed to attract, then the soldiers of the second regiment not so much, and the grieving conspirators were arrested. Louis-Philippe released him from prison, limiting him only to exile to the United States, from where he returned to Switzerland in 1838. The rest of the conspirators were put on trial, but in view of the release of the main culprit and the humiliating letter read at the trial, in which Louis Napoleon repented of his crime, praised the magnanimity and mercy of the king and asked for mercy for his supporters, the court had only to acquit them all. But in fact, for all the absurdity of the situation, it benefited Napoleon's image. The pro-Bonapartist newspapers presented the young upstart as the heir to the legend of the great emperor, and greatly increased his publicity. Well, I believe that if even such a prank raises a politician's popularity, the regime is in big trouble. And they were, indeed, at the level of the system itself. The fact that the system, represented by 240,000 of the richest people, worked virtually for itself, the rich elect the rich who pass laws favorable to the rich, could not but lead to an increase in corruption, which was constantly blamed on the system by many opposition newspapers. Interestingly, Louis-Philippe himself, who was indeed a very successful businessman and one of the richest men in France, was not involved in corruption schemes. But one could not say that about the constantly changing governments. At the same time, even among these 1% of the richest people was a privileged group, the so-called financial aristocracy. That is, bankers and stock exchange magnates, as well as mine owners. But the industrial bourgeoisie was deprived. For example, because of the policy of protectionism and high duties, it was not profitable for industrialists to import important resources for industrialization: coal, cotton, wool, ore, as well as equipment from Great Britain. In turn, because of this, the rate of industrial growth in France was lower than in the North German states, primarily Prussia, and the industrialists became the opposition in the House of Representatives. High duties also severely depressed coastal port cities, which had nothing to do without ocean trade. Nothing to do. It can be called the motto of the workers of all of France, primarily Paris of course, because the work due to the low rates of industrialization was not enough. At the same time, high competition for jobs led to fall in wages, and workers and the middle class responded to the government's policies with a rise in socialist and republican sentiment. which began in the 1840s and was supported by the increasing numbers of opposition newspapers. A Frenchman is of the same opinion as the newspaper he has been reading for the last 6 months, was what Stendhal seemed to say. Newspapers, there were indeed many, over 150 in Paris alone, and all people read and discussed newspapers because what else was there to do? The government took measures ranging from suppressing demonstrations and protests to trying to negotiate with their leaders. But the most important thing, to reform and to remove or at least reduce the electoral census, the system did not want. The number of persons capable of exercising political power with sense and independence does not exceed 200,000 in France. This is what the then Prime Minister François Guizot said about the possibility of increasing the number of voters. Or here's another saying of his that I like. Enrich yourselves, gentlemen, and you will become voters. If you are homeless, just buy a house. This was the state of affairs in France until 1843, when Louis-Philippe decided to boost his popularity with a little victorious war, and Mexico was a suitable whipping boy. The occasion for the war was rather ridiculous. During the turmoil of 1828, marauders in Mexico City had sort of destroyed the store of a French pastry chef, who had turned to the king for protection only in 1843. Supporting its subject, France demanded 600,000 pesos in compensation for moral damages. Mexico refused to pay such a sum, and so was the occasion for the war, which went down in history as the Pastry War. France helps and stands up for its citizens. Sounds cool and respectable. And the war was going quite well. The French troops landed in Yucatan and their fleet blockaded Mexican ports. The only thing to do was to wait until the Mexicans realized that the blockade was hitting the economy harder than reparations. But then there was an unexpected event that prevented the government from getting political points, just like 14 years ago. During the suppression of the already usual protest in Paris, the National Guard moved to the side of the protesters, and they started a full-fledged uprising. The move of the National Guard to the side of the rebels frightened Louis-Philippe, and he accepted the resignation of the Guizot government and was ready to carry out electoral reforms. But it was too late. The rebels seized government buildings and demanded the overthrow of the king. As a result, the king and his family fled to England, and under pressure from the crowd in the Parliament building on August 2, 1844, the Second French Republic was proclaimed. The people got what they wanted. The voters were now all men aged 21 and over, and they elected both deputies to the Parliament, the National Assembly, and the President, which will play a big role in our story. Preparations began for the election of the latter. There were 5 candidates for the presidency, and the favorite was General Cavaignac, the head of the provisional government and a convinced Republican, representing the interests of the middle class and the bourgeoisie. But the National Assembly and the members of the provisional government forgot that France is not only Paris, and that the absolute majority of the population was still represented by peasants. So what did the peasants want? The peasants wanted France to be respected and feared again. They wanted Napoleon, whose reign they considered a golden age, and the most Napoleon-like person was who? That's right, Charles-Louis Napoleon. After living in Switzerland for a while, he moved to London, and after the revolution he came to the country and with help of his agents, mostly veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, he began to expand his existing support base and managed to get elected to the National Assembly before the presidential election. In doing so, he tried to reach as many voters as possible. To the right he promised stability and order, to the left he promised jobs and increased prosperity. To the Republicans he was an ardent supporter of the Republic, to the monarchists he was the heir to the great name of Napoleon. Populists, you say? Yes, he will answer. I suppose so. Populism proved extremely effective in the newly born republic, and in the February 1845 elections, out of 9 million voters with a 75% turnout, Napoleon received the votes of 5.5 million. So in a sense, Guizot was right. The people who had just become voters chose the man who promised them the most. Thus, he became a president of the French Republic at the age of 36. By the way, how did European monarchs, first of all Prussia, Austria and Russia, react to the establishment of the Republic? And how did it affect the European concert? They did not react in any way. We can say that they accepted the already established trend. The first two countries themselves at that moment suffered from the increase of liberal and nationalist sentiments, and a decent amount of forces in these countries was spent to suppress them. Therefore, they could not gather a contingent of many hundreds of thousands to suppress the new republic. The European concert was finally over. In the same year, the war with Mexico ended victoriously, and although the money spent on the war was clearly more than received from reparations, the victory was still a victory. The conquered territories in Algeria, into which several 100,000 Frenchmen had moved over the years, were transformed into 3 departments. To suppress the resistance of the local population, as well as generally to conduct wars not on the territory of the metropole, the so-called French Foreign Legion was created. The speciality of this unit was that anyone could enroll there, from foreigners to criminals. There was virtually no identity check, and when joining you could make up a new name. Having served in the Legion, a soldier could get new documents, a new biography, and thus a second chance in life. This way, France got rid of undesirable social elements and received combat-ready formations, which could be used in any way necessary, since the nameless were not asked anyway. These novelties were rather the development of already existing ideas and projects, and were not the merits of Napoleon, and he had no control over the cabinet and parliament at that time. So the first really important decision he made was the war with Belgium in 1848. The situation was ideal for that. Belgium had just nationalized the assets of its main investor and guarantor of its independence, Great Britain, leading to the breakdown of diplomatic relations. We will not talk about the reasons for such a rash action. The important thing is the result. Belgium was defenseless. 1848 is also the year of the beginning of the Spring of Nations, a series of European liberal revolutions and national uprisings. And Austria and Prussia, in addition to the fight against the liberals, were now forced to fight the uprisings of Hungarians and Poles respectively, and well, could not charge France for aggression. The war was successful, and by August Belgium was occupied and annexed. The Belgians themselves reacted to the annexation to France, for the most part, quite positively. Belgium was a constitutional monarchy, much like Louis Philippe's July monarchy, and the idea of replacing it with a republic was attractive among the people. Of course, the French-speaking Valons, who did not mind becoming part of something bigger, namely the French nation, accepted the new state of affairs much better than the Dutch-speaking Flemings, who even staged a few uprisings. But on the whole, the situation was tolerable. Nevertheless, the lovers of the Republic did not have long to rejoice. As it turned out, it had only a few months to live de facto. All this time, Napoleon was gradually increasing his power, putting loyal people in the posts of ministers and generals, and preparing for a coup. Time forced him to hurry. Under the constitution, the president could not be elected for more than one consecutive term, 4 years. The parliament refused to change it, and 1848 should have been the last year of his reign. But it wasn't. During the war with Belgium, Napoleon declared war on the newly formed Roman Republic, intending to bring Pope Pius IX back to Rome, with the support of the kings of Naples and Piedmont. This sounded rather strange to the French. The Republic not only did not help the Republic, but on the contrary, suppressed it. But 2 weeks after the victory over the Roman revolutionaries, everything began to fall into place. On the anniversary of the coronation of Napoleon I, December 2, 1848, troops occupied the buildings of the Legislative Assembly and other government offices. By decree of the President of the Republic, the Assembly was dissolved and most of its deputies were arrested. Louis Napoleon gained absolute power in his hands. On December 6, the Pope regained control of central Italy, gave Napoleon his blessing, and the clergy began to agitate hard for him. Then, under police pressure, a referendum was held, where citizens were asked, roughly speaking, do they agree with what happened? So they agreed. 7.5 million votes against 640,000. In January 1848, a constitution was published, modeled on the Consular Constitution of 1799. It was a purely monarchical constitution, although with an elected president for 10 years. However, for several more years, Napoleon hesitated to turn the republic into monarchy de jure, and still remained a republican in words. He waited for the right moment for the final step, some victory in war or success in domestic politics, and having gained full executive power, he made two important changes. First, being a staunch advocate of free trade, he lowered the customs rates on the resources needed by industry: coal, iron, steel, wool, which then played an important part in its strengthening, and thus in the growth of prosperity. French industry had other problems, of course, but I will talk about those later. Secondly, to fight future wars, he doubled the army budget. And the first such war was the Sardinian-Austrian War of 1852, over Lombardy and the zone of influence in central Italy, which France entered on the side of the first. For the help in the war, Sardinia promised to give France territories with French-speaking populations, Savoy and Nice. The war went quite well, and lasted less than a year, because the Austrians were still weakened by rebellions, and in a serious battle the French and Austrians never came together. The main Battle of Taranto involved armies of Bavaria and Württemberg. So in a sense, the war even turned into a suppression of the rebellion of the Venetians, whose independence was not favorable to either side of the conflict. Having won the war, Sardinia strengthened its position as the leader of Italy, and France received the promised Savoy and Nice, although only 8 years later, just after the Italian unification. But a victory is a victory, especially achieved with so little blood. And it increased nationalist sentiment and Napoleon's popularity, which allowed for a new referendum to be held as early as 1853. The question put to the referendum was as follows: do you agree that the head of the state becomes emperor, and the state is transformed into the French Galactic Empire? Sort of like that. 97% in favor, with 80% turnout, is not a very credible statistic. Although if we assume that at least half of those who didn't participate were against it, then the picture becomes more convincing. Anyway, on July 8, 1843, the president was proclaimed Emperor of the French, under the name of Louis Napoleon III. The Bonapartist tradition took into account the 12 days that the Euro-Parisian authorities considered the minor son of Napoleon I as emperor. L'Empire est fait. The empire was created. A month later, an updated constitution came into force. Universal suffrage was preserved, but the lower house of parliament, to which deputies were elected, now had only a consultative function, and there were two candidates for a deputy seat, a government candidate and an opposition candidate. At the same time, votes were counted by mayors, i.e. officials, who could falsify the results without much trouble. The Senate, the upper house, had more powers and could even oppose the emperor, but it consisted of cardinals, marshals and admirals, as well as citizens appointed by the emperor. It could be called some kind of protection against tyranny. The good old censorship returned. The post of censor was introduced, who checked newspapers before they were printed. But in principle it was relatively mild. It was allowed to criticize the government, the main thing was not to call people to something bad. And in general, the style of Napoleon III's rule can be described as the soft hand of a dictator. For example, the right to assemble was preserved. Moreover, over the time, the regime became more and more liberal, a great rarity for autocracies. Usually the opposite happens, and I will talk about it in more detail at the end of the story. European monarchs, by the way, accepted the new emperor positively. The monarchy for them was any better than a republic. Only the Russian emperor refused to accept him as an equal. But Russia at the time was behind in all parameters for about 50 years, and did not pose a threat. Austria and Prussia were also wary of Napoleon, remembering what Napoleon I had done 50 years earlier. And as it turned out later, they were wary for a reason. For several years, Napoleon had been promoting the topic of the so-called natural borders of France in the political environment. What's that? It is a concept that France is naturally protected geographically from all sides. The Atlantic Ocean in the north and the west, the Pyrenees in the south, the Alps and the Rhine River in the east, and should strive for such borders. And France actually had such borders during the First Republic, after its first victories, until Napoleon annexed a bunch of other territories to France, from Holland to Croatia, just because he could. After his defeat, all of the conquered territories were taken away, with Prussia being the biggest beneficiary, gaining most of the Rhineland. In addition to its defensive role, the Rhineland had large deposits of iron and coal, and was a major industrial center, the most important pillar of Prussian industry, which by 1854 had caught up with France in absolute terms. So, by the future war, Napoleon was going to solve several issues at once: industrial, defense and image, saying that now we will take revenge for Uncle Napoleon. And there was not even a far-fetched reason. Being a part of the Republic and a large urban population made the Rhine region more liberal in comparison with the rest of Prussia and Germany as a whole, and uprisings there were not rare. An armed uprising of the Republicans was underway at the time, which Prussia was suppressing with mixed success. In his speech from the throne on January 14, 1854, Napoleon condemned Prussia's actions, accused it of disrespecting the people's will and their desire for a republican form of government, and demanded that Prussia established an independent Rhine Republic on the left bank of the Rhine. Prussia refused to comply with this ultimatum, and a formal pretext for war was obtained. By means of a treaty on duty-free trade with Great Britain, Napoleon secured its non-participation in the coming war. Austria had recently been fought, and there was a truce between the countries. In addition to Prussia, Bavaria controlled part of the left bank of the Rhine, but France also had a truce with it, and its territories were not included in the ultimatum. Its participation in the future war depended entirely on the success of Prussian diplomacy, and it had no particular influence on the course of the war. Its army was defeated in the last one. If it did not join, good, one less enemy. If it did join, also good, the French would take away Palatinate from them. That was the logic. Therefore, the plan was that only German states from Prussia's spheres of influence would side with it, and the French army was to quickly defeat the Prussian contingent on the left bank of the Rhine and then stand in defense. However, the situation turned out a little differently, or rather quite differently. Austria chose to trade its reputation for participation in this war, and Russia joined the war after it. As a result, France had to call for help from Spain and Naples, and then Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire, interested in weakening Russia, and defend itself as in the good old War of the First Coalition, with the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of people and a war of attrition. Increased military budget and a large amount of stockpiled equipment and ammunition helped. Gradually, the balance of power shifted in favor of France, and from defense its armies began to go on the offensive. Then the least interested opponents began to withdraw from the war, up to Austria and Russia. And when a new wave of Republican revolt broke out in Prussia, now covering the whole country, its king surrendered and admitted defeat. Under the Treaty of Berlin, concluded in October 1855, the Rhineland, consisting of territory taken from Prussia and Bavaria, became an independent republic, all as Napoleon had promised, at least on paper. Although they had an independent domestic policy, foreign policy and army were under French control, so that the republic is more correctly called autonomy. And the war could have been called a success for France. The benefits were obvious and outweighed the losses, if not for one thing. Defeat at the hands of France ignited in the German countries pan-Germany sentiment, the desire to form a unified German state, which is not surprising. The war involved almost all German states, and still France, being a single state, was able to win, and only for 1.5 years. Strength in unity, that was the conclusion of the Germans. Although it is impossible to say with certainty that without this defeat the Germans would not have sought unification, we can say for sure that it accelerated it considerably. By the next year, in the course of several unions, only 4 of more than 20 states remained. Nevertheless, the result of the unions was not clear at the time, but the result of the victory was right there and right now. As soon as the emperor emerged, the French beat the Germans, beat the Russians, made friends with the British, and got resources for industry. So Napoleon's popularity from the war only grew. The empire showed the power of its weapons, and, having established itself as a leader in land warfare, became a model to follow. In 1857, for example, France sent a military mission to Japan, more specifically to the Tokugawa shogunate. French advisors helped in training and modernizing the shogun's army, which however did not help them in the Boshin War, where the emperor's supporters won. But it was not the fault of the French. And then France sent another mission, already in Imperial Japan, so the relationship did not suffer. But it wasn't just the army alone that made the empire strong. At least that's what Napoleon wanted to show. In order to show the achievements in France in industry and science, in Paris in 1856 began preparations for a universal exhibition. Such exhibitions had been held since the First Republic, on an almost regular basis. But by the time Louis Napoleon became emperor, they had ceased to be held. Primarily because such exhibitions were held in London, the center of world industry, and it was easier for the French to go there. But the growth rate of the French economy was still lagging behind the German economy, and the gap only widened, which forced to try to hold the exhibition in France, preparations for which were completed by the following year. The problem for French industry, however, was not the investment that such exhibitions attract, nor the taxes and nor the duties. The name of that problem was the first demographic transition. How did industrialization in the 19th century generally work from a demographic point of view? Peasants always had a lot of children. In the 19th century, about 5-6 on average. And with the development of medicine and agriculture, their mortality rate decreased. And so that the peasants' land would not be divided into small parts, becoming useless in the end, it would be inherited by one son, most often the eldest. Daughters were given in marriage, and the remaining sons had a choice. Either to become a laborer for the landowner, or to go to the city in search of a better life. Peasants who went to the city were the main driving force in the development of industry. They worked at factories and at the same time became consumers of their products, significantly increasing their contribution to GDP compared to peasants. At the same time, the average number of children among the townspeople fell significantly, because in the village children are laborers, and in the city a burden. And with the increase in the share of urban population, the total birth rate fell. However, in France everything happened differently. Because of the laws on equal inheritance, it was not profitable for peasants to have many children, which deprived the industry of future workers, which in turn slowed down its development. French politicians realized this only by 1860s, and Napoleon abolished this law. But the effect of its abolition manifested itself only after 20 years, and still was less than in other European countries. But better that than nothing. The quicker solution was to reduce mortality. The fewer people who die at a young age, the more of them can work and leave offspring. The highest mortality rate has always been among the poor, and so reforms were aimed at improving their well-being. So in 1862, a whole package of social reforms was passed, from the creation of compulsory primary education and healthcare, and in 1870 compulsory secondary education, to a standardized working day, a state insurance fund, and permission to form labor unions. Napoleon tried to carry out social reforms before that. It is difficult to say why. Either he really cared about the problems of the working class, or because he was a populist. Probably something in between. But since as an emperor he relied primarily on conservatives and the bourgeoisie, who could only make the cuckoo sign from such ideas, it was possible to begin to implement reforms only now, when there was an objective reason. Around this time, a large-scale renovation of Paris was underway, which had grown considerably over the course of the story, from about 500,000 to 1.5 million. The existing infrastructure could no longer support such a large population, and so Paris needed to be renovated. As I said, Napoleon lived for a while in London, which had survived the Great Fire of 1666, and therefore was rebuilt and had a more modern look. The emperor himself was interested in architecture, and was, according to contemporaries, a hard-working man, trying to get into details. For example, he could often be caught working on drawings of new streets in Paris. London was his point of reference when he commissioned the prefect of Senate department, Georges Haussmann, to rebuild the capital, giving him virtually unlimited funds and unlimited powers. Anything could be demolished and rebuilt anywhere. And Haussmann used his powers. More than 60% of Parisian real estate was replaced, which probably did not please then and today's lover of medieval architecture with a lack of planning. To replace the narrow unconsecrated streets with a lot of dead ends, breeding grounds for crime and disease, came consecrated straight wide streets with alleys, the boulevards, with high-rise for that time houses with unified architecture, the style which acquired the name of Second Empire. This style can be characterized as follows. I wanted to look expensive and beautiful as in the past, but with the use of new technology and materials. Also, the sewerage, water and gas pipelines, which were previously in complete chaos, were completely rebuilt, and, following the example of London, a large number of parks appeared within the city limits, so that the citizens had the opportunity to visit nature and take a walk. Basically, the idea of just walking around the city appeared. In the French language even appears the word flânerie, the act of walking around the boulevards for the purpose of entertainment and aesthetic pleasure from the observation of city life. In Paris of the past, it would hardly be possible to walk like that. Such a type of entertainment as tourism also began to appear. Before, the idea of going and looking at architectural monuments was at least strange, but pilgrimage was another matter. Spiritual enlightenment, curing diseases, all that stuff. However, with the growth of the educated population grew an interest in history, and tourism began to some extent separate from pilgrimage in the second half of the 19th century. So the first places to visit were temples and monasteries. Parisians remembered Notre Dame, which had previously stood in a dilapidated state, being no one needed. Or take, for example, the island of Mont Saint-Michel, with its beautiful abbey. These and other monuments were reconstructed during the reign of Louis Napoleon, who was a history buff. But the French did not stop at reviving old monuments, they also created new ones. In 1869, to show the world the achievements of French engineering, began construction of a 300-meter steel tower, which was timed to the new Universal Exhibition, and was conceived as temporary construction, but having gained great success and popularity, exists to this day. Paris itself became very popular, and later other European cities began to take an example from it. And, of course, all this celebration of life was caused not only by Napoleon's desire to create a beautiful and comfortable city. Wide streets, having several connections at once, became impossible to block with barricades, so beloved by Parisians, and also allowed to promptly bring troops to suppress protests. And magnificent buildings of state services inspired people's respect for this very state. All this Napoleon, however, did not hide. Another purpose of the renovation, which cannot be considered strictly as done for the people or for the state, was the construction of railroad stations. During Napoleon's reign, the French railroad network became, in fact, a network covering the entire country. Before his reign, there were only a few dozen separate lines. Paris was the center of this network and served as the main transit point, which required a large number of stations. And stations, as you understand, are not small buildings. Moreover, the railroads themselves also needed to be brought into the city, so the demolition of buildings helped make room for railroad needs. In any case, in talking about domestic policy, I have covered quite a long period of time, about 15 years. What happened during this time in foreign policy? And indeed, a lot of things happened. In 1863, France founded the Latin Monetary Union, which included Italy, Spain and Switzerland, and then several other countries. The Union obliged the member countries to bring their currencies to a single standard, with fixed weights and ratios of silver to gold, which effectively turned the Union into a single currency area, which in turn greatly simplified trade relations. In the same year, Napoleon negotiated with the Netherlands to buy Luxembourg, which had been in their personal union after the Belgian War of Independence. Now that Belgium had been annexed and the Rhineland had become a de facto autonomy of France, Luxembourg had become a complete enclave and was defenseless. However, Prussia, which had recently defeated Austria in the war for leadership of Germany, intervened in the deal and demanded that France should give up its claim to Luxembourg, which had pro-German sentiment, threatening a declaration of war. Napoleon apparently refused, saying that France could win using only the forces of the regular army. And he was right, considering that Prussia was supported in this war only by the states of the North German Union, while France was helped by the now united Italy. The war lasted 4 months and ended with the defeat of the Prussian army, although France and Italy also suffered significant losses. Napoleon, however, did not demand anything from Prussia, except to recognize the purchase of Luxembourg. France had gotten all she needed from the Germans. Further wars will bring our nations nothing but death. For Prussia, however, this ill-considered war was a major humiliation and seriously shattered its position as a candidate for leadership in Germany. In 1868, France helped Italy in the war against Austria-Hungary for the territories inhabited by Italians, and in 1871-75, together with the same Italians, helped the Poles in their War of Independence. Italy fought openly and France supported them with money, equipment and also sent a foreign legion as volunteers. But of course, France had interests not only in Europe, and therefore French troops defended them on other continents. For example, in 1866 they organized a punitive expedition to Korea, whose government executed 9 French missionaries and about 10,000 Korean Christians. The expedition was successful. Korea allowed the practice of Christianity, and Napoleon partially regained the approval of the clerical community, which he had lost by reforming education, smoothed over an internal problem with an external success, so to speak. The same was the reason for intervention in Vietnam in 1878. This time France simply took away the occupied lands from Vietnam. And 5 years later, during a new expedition, it completely annexed both it and its vassal Cambodia, turning these territories into a colony, French Indochina. And this colony became a good source of tea, coffee, rice, timber, and in the future rubber. But where the French really went wild was in Africa, the pace of colonization of which accelerated significantly in the last third of the 19th century. Before that, France's holdings in Africa were limited to ports in the west of the continent, Algeria and islands in the Indian Ocean, limited only to trade with local countries and tribes. But with the development of technology and medicine, living there became easier and conquering them became simpler. There were also reasons to go inland. Growing industry demanded more resources, workers and markets, all of which Africa had to offer. Although, of course, the main motive, in my opinion, can be formed as follows. Colonies are cool and prestigious. Look, Britain has colonies. Lots of them. India, Canada, Australia and so on. Huge territories. And Britain has a huge industry. Yes, Britain is a great country. You can't argue with that. But we, insert the name of any major European country, are also a great country, a great nation. In fact, we are even better than them. This is us who insert accomplishment. So what? We need colonies too, and more of them. And if we can seize something and it won't be to our detriment, both economically and diplomatically, we will seize it. Colonization started small. The French, under the governor of Senegal, Louis Faidherbe, built several forts along the Senegal River, to control the trade in gummi arabic, an acacia resin then mainly used as an adhesive. This did not please the local kingdoms, and the French had to fight them for a while, taking away the land they needed. Then, in 1865, French possessions there were expanded again, mostly on the whim of Faidherbe, who had not consulted the government. The governor after this incident was transferred to Algeria, but it was thanks to his actions that France, of all European states, was the most prepared for further colonization of West Africa. Nevertheless, the scramble for Africa was still 15 years away, and during that time, several extremely important events took place in Europe. In January 1875, Napoleon annexed the Rhineland. There was no reason for this action, he and the government simply decided that there would be no reaction from the Germans. And they were right, but only partially. On the same day, he signed a law making teaching in the French literary language compulsory throughout the empire. In this way, France sought to destroy dialects and local languages, like Breton, Occitan and so on, and to franchise the German and Dutch populations in the annexed territories, thus creating a unified French cultural field. And this is where the Germans went berserk. The annexation of the Rhineland was not a pleasant event in itself, but the Germans assumed that someday, for example after Napoleon's death or later, they would get theirs back. But the news that these lands were trying to be franchised was a turning point for the Germans. In the same year, in the Saxon city of Leipzig, there was held the All-German Conference, at which it was anonymously decided to unite Germany into a single state, with a single army, a single customs and currency area, under the leadership of Austria, but with the preservation of independent domestic policy of the participating countries. The resulting state covered almost all of Central Europe, had more than 80 million population, and thanks to investments of German capitalists in the underdeveloped non-German part of the country, rapidly developing industry, which at the time of unification was already equal to the British and approximately twice as large as the French. Its main goal was to reclaim the territories inhabited by Germans, primarily from France. But the army of the United Germany left much to be desired. Only 3 years later they prepared for a new war, but they could not declare it openly, because in this case France would definitely be supported by Poland, Italy and Spain. So the German government decided to fabricate a dispatch with a message from their emperor to the French ambassador, which could be considered an insult, belittling France's honor and thus forcing it to announce war itself. But although public opinion in France was inclined to declare war to teach those Germans a lesson again, Napoleon himself, by then much older, he was in his 70s, did not want this war. So it just didn't happen. It's hard to say whether it would have been better for the French to fight then, or to wait for the Germans to attack themselves, as it happened. Besides, the French allies already had their eyes set on Africa, the partition of which began the very next year, when Morocco was divided between France and Spain. Then came the war with Tunisia, the establishment of a protectorate in Madagascar, and a large-scale expedition to conquer all of West Africa. What was difficult to think about 20 years ago became a reality. One machine gun was stronger than hundreds of spears or even smoothbore rifles, of which there were not a few in Africa. This made it possible to subdue the local population with astonishing ease in just a few years. Thus was born the new French colonial empire. But in fact, France also conducted a small war in Europe in 1880s against the Netherlands for this piece of land, Dutch Limburg. So why was it necessary to fight over it? Apart from the ugly borders formed after the annexation of the Rhineland, which I wouldn't be surprised that the French government and Napoleon cared about and were the main reason. Limburg, as well as Luxembourg, belonged to Belgium until 1838, when Belgium was forced to give them up. Now Belgium, as well as its claims, was owned by France, which offered the Netherlands to sell their part of Limburg, or at least Maastricht and its surroundings, separated from the rest of the country by a small isthmus 5 kilometers long. The Netherlands repeatedly refused, so it was up to the French army to solve the issue. And in 3 months they solved it. Limburg became part of France. These wars were the last for Napoleon. On October 12, 1885, at the age of 77, he died of a heart attack. A man of the era, he had ruled France for over 40 years, first as president and then as emperor. To his son and successor, Eugene Louis Napoleon IV, he passed on an industrialized country with a strong army, a large number of colonies and the possibility of gaining even more colonies. However, he also gave the country some problems. First of all, this monster in the east, whose revanchist sentiments, though diminished, were still strong, and after the partition of Africa, they became even stronger. The second problem was the unstable vertical of power. You may have noticed that towards the end of the story, I started using the phrase Napoleon and the government. It was for a reason. The point is that, as I said, as time went on, Napoleon's regime and constitution became more and more liberal and free. First, they allowed parliament to evaluate the government's policies. Then they allowed deputies to officially question it. Then the lower house of parliament was given the right of legislative initiative, on an equal footing with the emperor. Then they began to allow anyone to participate in the elections, and made the counting of results more open. Then, horror of horrors, they removed censorship from the press. Unthinkable! The Frenchman is of the same opinion as the newspaper he's been reading for the last 6 months. Now, the opposition newspapers could get themselves a Frenchman like that. Meanwhile, as the emperor's health deteriorated, more and more power was delegated to the government. And all was well while the popular Napoleon was in power. The people were happy, the elites were happy too, but now he was dead. And now his son would have to face a society that had more freedoms than when his father was on the throne. A society that was increasingly asking the question, why do we need an emperor? Such was the history of France under the reign of Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Not a genius and in fact not even a talent, but a determined man who relied heavily on chance and a man whom the chance largely favored. I have ideas for the sequel to the story, so I may well do it. It all depends on your feedback. I won't set conditions, but the more views, likes and comments, the better the chances. So if you like the video and want to see a sequel, you know what to do. You can also take a look at my other videos, each of which I try to make special and interesting even for those who have not played the games on which these videos are based. This is where I say goodbye to you.